The winner. Sorry, the electricity anytime we touch it. Charles Darwin was born 210 years ago, February 12th, 1809. And in recent years, his birthday, which will be on Tuesday this year, has been celebrated as International Darwin Day, an annual opportunity to celebrate the principles that guided Darwin's life: perpetual curiosity, scientific thinking, and a hunger for truth. These values resonate deeply with our UU fourth principle of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, our fifth source of reason and science. And one of the tragedies of the ongoing creation versus evolution debate, if it's really a debate, is that coming to terms with Darwin's theories of natural selection and common descent, those were among the greatest, maybe they were the greatest challenge intellectually of the late 19th century. But we live in the early 21st century, long past the point at which the tenets of evolution became basic science. And one reason it's significant to celebrate Darwin Day in a UU congregation is that both sides of Darwin's family were largely Unitarian. And while it's true that Darwin was baptized in an Anglican church, he attended an Anglican boarding school, and he was married by an Anglican priest, it's also the case that growing up, both Charles and his siblings attended the local Unitarian chapel with their mother, and that the liturgy used in that Anglican wedding when he married Emma Wedgwood were, quote, adapted to suit the Unitarians. Relatedly, some of our Unitarian and Universalist forebears were among the earliest religious leaders to embrace the paradigm-shifting implications of Darwin's discoveries, that we humans were not a little lower than the angels, we are but a little higher than the apes, and deeply interconnected and interdependent with the other species, the other ecosystems of this planet. We now know on the DNA level there is a 1.23% difference between we humans and chimpanzees. We humans are not uniquely special creations. We are, again, one among many species in the animal kingdom, called to practice respect for the interdependent web of all existence, in the words of our seventh principle. This year's Darwin Day sermon is inspired by a book published last year by Randall Fuller, a professor of American literature at the University of Kansas. I'm not clear whether Dr. Fuller is a Unitarian. He may just be, as is often the case, an English professor obsessed with the Transcendentalists. But when I saw that he had written this book called The Book That Changed America about how he was listing the people, I'm like, those are all Unitarians, and how they had influenced Darwin. I was like, yes, please. Thank you for writing this book for me. So I want to share a little bit about it with you. Fuller again explores how the history of how Darwin's On the Origin of Species was interpreted by some of its earliest readers, particularly our Transcendentalist forebears such as Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, the child welfare reformer Charles Brace, and the abolitionist Franklin Sanborn, again, all of whom have strong Unitarian roots. But let me first set the stage a little of what was happening in the world on November 24th, 1859, when Charles Darwin published that landmark book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. For a few points of comparison, 1859 was also the year that Charles Dickens, also a Unitarian, released A Tale of Two Cities in a serialized weekly format. George Eliot's first novel, Adam Bede, came out, and John Stuart Mill's incredibly influential On Liberty was published. Politically, in late 1859, keep in mind that the United States was a little more than a year away at that point from the opening shots of the Civil War on April 12, 1861. And part of why that matters for our story today is that all of those Unitarian forebears we'll be focusing on today and how they first encountered Darwin's book, they were all involved quite heavily in the movement for the abolition of slavery. For instance, of the Secret Six who helped fund and supply John Brown's raid on the federal armory of Harper's Ferry, just down the road a piece from here, of those Secret Six, 5 were Unitarians and 2 were Unitarian ministers. And one of those was Sanborn, who hosted a party I'll tell you about in a second. John Brown's raid happened in mid-October 1859. Darwin's book was published just a little more than a month later in late November. So keep those 2 dates in mind again as I begin to tell you about a New Year's Eve gathering just a little less than a month from that at Franklin Sanborn's house. He had borrowed a copy of Darwin's book and introduced On the Origin of Species for the first time to his 3 guests, Brace, Alcott, and Thoreau. All 4 strongly supported John Brown, and again, Sanborn was one of the Secret 6 and had introduced Brown to Alcott and Thoreau a year earlier. Brown had been hanged just less than a month before that on December 2nd, 1859. Sanborn was pretty freaked out. I think he went to Canada 2 or 3 times, worried that people were going to arrest him, which was a real possibility. So the struggle for racial justice was at the forefront of their minds. Some of you may know that Brown thought he was going to succeed, so he didn't bother to burn the notes, of who had supported him and stuff like that. So the struggle for racial justice was at the forefront of their mind and served as this powerful lens as they first reflected on Darwin's ideas. And if you read Origin closely, Darwin very intentionally only spoke about plants and animals. He wasn't, it was very much aware of the implications for human beings, but let's not get into that right now, right? Let's just talk about plants and animals for now. He only in a single place at the end of Origin does he gesture to the implications for human beings. He says, quote, "In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." But for anti-slavery activists, the implications were clear. This is what Megan was talking about in the spoken meditation, that by hinting that all humans were biologically related, Darwin's work seemed to refute once and for all the idea that enslaved African Americans were a separate inferior species, that were just all this one human family. So these early Unitarians embraced this scientific support for that concept. But as they reflected further on Darwin's work, they also started to realize some more discomforting truths. They realized that Darwin's theories also posed enormous threats to their faith in God, as well as their trust that America was this country divinely chosen for the regeneration of the world. As they say, evolution giveth, evolution taketh away. It's interesting to consider how such radical ideas begin to spread, though. In this case, it's one particular copy of Darwin's book that had quite an unusually large impact on multiple cultural influencers. We're more than a century before the information age, of course, in which we find ourselves today. Books were neither instantly available, by a click of a button on a tablet, nor were the highlights of their content a mere click away, and people weren't instantaneously reviewing them, right? Things were moving at a much slower pace. In this particular copy of Darwin's book to which I'm alluding, it's housed today at Harvard University. You can go see it. Darwin himself had sent it to a man named Asa Gray, a Harvard professor who was considered the most important American botanist of the 19th century. I know that's very impressive. You're all wondering about who was the important botanist of the 19th century. Dr. Gray had lent that copy, which he had immediately read closely and heavily annotated. He'd lent it to Charles Brace, one of those Unitarian abolitionists I mentioned earlier, who happened to be a cousin of his wife. Brace brought that copy to the New Year's Day party at Sanborn's house, where Bronson Alcott and Thoreau were also guests. Thoreau's Walden had been published about 6 years before, in 1854, and many of the details and layers that I could add to the story. One of my favorite anecdotes is just why was Thoreau there on that New Year's Day in 1860? It's said that he came because he had nothing better to do. He came because he liked to banter with Alcott and play the wise counselor to Sanborn, and he came because he was hungry. To share with you some of the reactions to these new ideas in Darwin's book, Sanborn was generally greatly appreciative of Darwin, especially, again, these implications for the abolitionist movement, and he soon wrote an enthusiastic letter along those lines to the renowned Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, who used to, among other things, he kept a gun in his desk because he helped with the Underground Railroad, and he was ready there. There's a saying, it's not paranoid if they really are after you. But Brace responded to the book, so Sanborn responded pretty positively to it. Brace responded really on a whole other level, soon telling people he had read the book 13 times, and perhaps he had. He really latched on to Darwin's teachings about the role that the environment plays and found in it a lot of support for his work with the Children's Aid Society, really realizing that we need to give children a positive environment because it matters so much. How do we allow such disparate conditions to happen between children who grow up in the suburbs, not then, but suburbs that grow up in a nicer environment versus those who grow up in ghettos? Thoreau was impacted further still. He was already a fan of Darwin, stretching back almost 2 decades earlier to his reading of Darwin's travelogue, The Voyage of the Beagle. And in 1860, Thoreau would grapple with the ideas contained in Origin as thoroughly and insightfully as any American of that period. By the end of January, when pirated editions of the book became available in New England, he secured a copy from the Concord Library and began taking copious notes. So apparently that's how it worked. Pretty often, the library would have pirated copies. Like, publishing was complicated in the 19th century. Thoreau and Darwin approached nature in similar ways. They both had this habit of they would just spend hours in nature, observing and reflecting and tracking those observations over time, these elaborate spreadsheets long before Excel existed. Reading Origin, Thoreau discovered someone else who understood nature as he did, as abounding and vibrant. Each tiny niche that Thoreau would pay attention to, or that Darwin would, they would just see it thriving with life. Each interstice filled with a lot going on, each living thing a small part of constant change, a participant in this struggle and for development, brimming with potential and significance. The intimacy and intricacy of their writing reminds me of the specificity that is characterized by much of the late Mary Oliver's poetry. She didn't write abstractly about grasshoppers in general. Her poetry emerged from being enraptured by the very specific and the particular. In her words, who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaw back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous, complicated eyes. And now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. Along those lines, I should add that as much as Thoreau's writing often overflows with this ebullient celebration of nature's beauty, Thoreau also appreciated the full honesty of Darwin's observations about nature. They gave him permission to be honest about the full truth of what he observed in nature. Darwin's insights were built on this observation too, not just of beauty, but of the violent struggle among species as an engine of creation. What Tennyson called nature red in tooth and claw. That truth resonated with Thoreau as accurate about nature as he observed it in contrast to the lofty transcendentalist ideas about nature in theory discussed by his friends in parlors who didn't spend the time he spent in nature itself. Emerson, by comparison, neither studied Darwin's writings as thoroughly as Thoreau, nor did he fully accept the full implications of the Darwinian paradigm shift. Instead, Emerson read Darwin as he read most people, dipping into the book like a bee collecting pollen, flipping pages back and forth, seeking inspiration for his own essays. I should add that by no means were all our Unitarian and Universalist forebears supporters of Darwin. Of the 4 Unitarians at that New Year's Day evening in 1860, it was Bronson Alcott who serves as our most prominent example of a negative reaction. As Alcott understood it, Darwin's proposals, quote, reduced human life to chemistry, to mechanical processes, to a vulgar materialism. I can see some of you thinking, not that there's anything wrong with that. They portrayed, to his mind, a world destitute of spirit. Darwin began with plants and animals, which in Alcott's opinion was precisely the wrong approach. All questions from existence were to start from above, with God, with the ideal. But that was not the only way of viewing Darwin's worldview, as we have already seen reflected in Thoreau. To say a bit more, let me return briefly full circle to Dr. Asa Gray, the Harvard botany professor to whom Darwin personally mailed a copy of his book. The same book lent to his wife's cousin, Charles Brace, who brought it to that fateful New Year's Day party. Gray was almost certainly the first American to read Darwin's Origin in its entirety. As a brief side note, some of you will know about Darwin finding out before he published Origin about someone who also had similar ideas and sent him a letter. And it was actually a letter Darwin had written quite a bit earlier to Asa Gray that helped prove the intellectual priority of Darwin's insights. And in reviewing Darwin's book, Dr. Gray tried to emphasize how grateful he actually was for Darwin's work. For even as Darwin's ideas challenged Gray's Episcopal faith, Gray nevertheless appreciated how Darwin's book brought the world to life, how it showed the ways Darwin perceived the world as pulsing with meaning and significance. Darwin demonstrated with close scientific rigor that the world did not magically appear one day. As we know even more so today, we are part of a 13.7 billion-year-old universe story that is continuing to evolve. In that spirit, I'll conclude with the final paragraph of Darwin's 1859 book on the origin of species. Whereas many scientific texts are often not well written, no offense, but it's true, and become obsolete after new discoveries are made, Darwin's books have continued to be widely praised for the beauty of their prose and for being well worth revisiting many years later. And a lot of that's because Darwin was just closely observing and tracking nature. So that data continues to be inspiring and important to revisit. The same is actually true of Thoreau. Scientists have gone back and used some of his very close, detailed observations around Walden Pond to study climate change today because the data is helpful. We tracked it so closely and rigorously. So in that spirit, I invite you to consider anew these words from the conclusion to origin. Note that Darwin begins by naming things that we often perceive as solely negative, and then shows how those precise things are part of the engine of evolution. In Darwin's words, from the war of nature, from famine, from death, the most exalted object that we are capable of conceiving, the production of higher animals, directly follows. From the war of nature and famine and death, the production of higher animals follows. He then adds that famous line, there is a grandeur in this view of life. So many people are focusing on what they were losing, that we humans are a little lower than the angels. He says, don't miss this. There is a grandeur in this view of life. That whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful, most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. As we continue to navigate our way through the promises and perils of embracing the best of both science and spirituality, of reason and religion in the 21st century, I invite you to rise in body or spirit, turning in your great hymnals to hymn 343, A Fire Mist and a Planet.